History is like a jigsaw puzzle. As the pieces come together, they tell us not only about the past, but also about the human being. Today, we will touch upon perhaps one of the most fascinating corners of that puzzle. In a world shaken by the fall of Rome, another power was quietly but surely rising. It was not the power of swords and armies, but the power of faith and spirit. Like a tree sprouting from the ashes of the empire, the church became both the protector and the shaper of society. But this power did not come out of nowhere. Behind it were struggles, sacrifices, and an effort to build a new order. Today, I will tell you the story of this rise. How did a structure emerge in those times that filled the vacuum of leadership, enveloping villages and cities with monasteries, even consecrating the crowns of kings? How did the church and the papacy come to dominate not only faith, but also politics? And let's embark on this fascinating journey together. Perhaps you have never seen the human hunger for faith and power from such a perspective before. If you are ready, we will step into the foggy corridors of history. First stop, the fall of Western Rome and the church that filled the vacuum. Ah, my children, imagine now, Western Rome, the most powerful empire in the world, like a rock rolled off a mountaintop and shattered to pieces. In 476, that once great Rome, where all roads led to it, where even the gods were believed to rule men through it, fell to its knees. Hordes of barbarians marched through the gates, the gold-leafed halls were looted, and the people were left in despair, not knowing what to do. It is in such darkness that our story begins. The fall of Rome was not only a political catastrophe, it was the complete disintegration of an order, a way of life. Roads, trade, justice, all were thrown into chaos in an instant. People no longer knew who to trust, whose word to believe. The vacuum of authority, like a desolate plain, was open to all kinds of dangers. Kings, governors, generals, all had fallen or disappeared in turn. But in the middle of that vacuum was a structure that seemed to have been created for those days. The church. In those days, the church was not just a place of worship. It was a way to survive, a way to find meaning. Local priests had become leaders who uplifted the people and kept them together. It was these priests who gathered the trembling crowds in the town squares, consoled them and gave them hope again. But the church was not just a spiritual refuge. It also carried the seeds of a new order, a new leadership. It was slowly but surely becoming a force to replace the collapsing empire. As Rome fell, the church spread everywhere like a powerful network. Monasteries became not only places of prayer, but also centers where knowledge was stored, books copied, and even agriculture relearned. Just as the light of a single candle in a dark room illuminates everything around it, so the church played a role in society at that time. In the villages, in the towns, even in the ruins of the cities, the authority of the church became a way of salvation for the people who sought refuge. But you may be asking, how did this happen? How did one institution of faith become so powerful that it could replace an empire? The answer lies in the events and people I am about to describe. Who was the greatest supporter of this new power, rising from the ashes of Rome? It was preparing to step onto the stage of history. Let's take a look at the real face of this change through the story of Gregory the Great. Ah, my dear friends, after the fall of Rome, a silence descended on this land, but this silence was not a void, but the herald of a new era. In those dark days, a man emerged from the mists of history. His name was Gregory. Later, people would give him the title, the Great. But he did not earn this title as kings do on the battlefield. His victories were victories of faith, patience, and intelligence. Let me now tell you the story of Pope Gregory. It was 597 BC when death once again stalked the streets of Rome. The plague had cast a dark shadow over the people. People were helpless. Neither the splendor of old Rome nor the uncertainty of the new order could protect them from this catastrophe. It was in such chaos that Gregory appeared on the scene. But he was no ordinary leader. In fact, he had no desire to sit on the papal throne. In his youth, he had worked in the civil service, then left everything behind and retired to a monastery. But fate would take him from this humble life to become one of the world's greatest leaders. When he was elected Pope, Gregory knew very well that a leader must be not just a spiritual guide, but someone who responds to the concrete needs of his people. When the city was struggling with hunger, he organized the resources of the church and distributed bread to his people. When people were locked in their homes in fear, Gregory went to them, consoled them, gave them hope. But his greatest achievement was not limited to appealing to the hearts of the people. As a leader, he led the church into a new era. With his leadership, the papacy transformed from a center of faith into a political authority. Gregory's reign was also a period of reconstruction. In the ashes of Rome, a new order was being established with Gregory's vision. The church became the most important authority in the Western world during this period. Even the leaders of the barbarian tribes had to bow to his intelligence and leadership. Gregory skillfully combined faith and diplomacy, concluding peace treaties with the Lombards and strengthening relations with the Frankish kings. Thus began a period of stability under the leadership of the church in a land shaken by the fall of Rome. But my friends, Gregory's vision was not just political. He wanted to rebuild the soul of the people. To this end, he reformed church music, and it was during this period that the famous Gregorian chants took shape. These melodies were not only prayers, but also songs of hope that penetrated the hearts of a suffering people. In addition, his letters and theological texts added a new depth to the teachings of the church. Gregory was a father figure to his people. He was much more than a leader. But, dear friends, this story does not end here. Gregory's leadership was not answer to this question together, nor did this power grow in Gregory's wake. How did this power grow in Gregory's wake? How did this power grow in Gregory's wake? Let's look for the answer to this question together. My dear friends, think about it. In these dark days of chaos and uncertainty, when the might of Rome had faded into the dust of history, people needed a harbor to take refuge in, a light to cling to. This light was sometimes a prayer, sometimes a hymn, sometimes hidden behind silent stone walls. A movement was sprouting in this silence. They called it monasteries. And these monasteries became the lands where not only faith but also civilization flourished again. Now, I will tell you the story of the beginning of this great transformation. The story of Saint Benedict. He was 529. Saint Benedict was a hermit in a cave in the rocky hills of Subiaco. Why? Because he wanted to get away from the moral decadence that followed the fall of Rome and devote his soul to God. In a world where people were seeking profit and power, he dreamed of restoring the pure bond between God and man. For years he lived in silence and contemplation, but gradually people began to admire his life of wisdom. Benedict was no longer a lonely hermit when crowds began to come to his cave asking him for guidance. He was about to become the founder of a new way of life. When he founded the first monastery in Monte Cassino, Saint Benedict did not just build a place of worship, he built a way of life. He organized this way of life in a system called the Rule of Benedict. These rules formed the basis of monastic life and prescribed a discipline that was unprecedented until then. The principle of ore et labora, pray and work, was the essence of monastic life. In Benedict's vision, prayer and work were complementary sacred tasks. As they prayed, they nourished their souls, and as they worked, they met the physical needs of the community. But monasteries did not remain solely religious centers. Benedict's rules also transformed them into centers of education, health, and economic development. Monasteries became guardians of knowledge in the Dark Ages. Without the monks who copied and preserved the works of ancient Rome and Greece, we might not even hear the stories of those great civilizations today. Monasteries also became the first hospitals to heal the sick, schools to teach farming, and centers of economic vitality. The monks worked the land, practiced craftsmanship, and rebuilt the lives of the people. These Benedictine rules did not stay within the four walls of a monastery. It soon spread across Europe, and the monastic movement became one of the cornerstones of the rebirth of civilization. The spiritual leadership of the Church, combined with the material and intellectual contributions of the monasteries, brought order to society as a whole. The torch lit by Saint Benedict at Monte Cassino has continued to burn throughout Europe for centuries. But my friends, let us pause here and reflect. The rise of the monasteries symbolized not only the rebirth of civilization, but also the growth of the power of the Church. This power grew so great over time that even kings had to kneel before it. But how was the Church's authority in the world shaped in the process? And what tests did this authority together? Dear listeners, imagine that the footsteps of the legions that once echoed along the glorious roads of Rome were long gone. People were now trying to find their way in the chaos that followed this great order. It was at this point that society needed a new order. On the one hand, they wanted to control the chaos, and on the other hand, they wanted people to have spiritual guidance. The feudal system laid the political and economic foundation for this order, while the Church provided the spiritual guidance. However, far from being in conflict with each other, these two forces intertwined to form a complementary structure. Let us now examine the role of the Church in the feudal system and how this relationship took shape. By the 8th century, monasteries all over Europe had become not only places of worship, but also large landowners. These monasteries, elevated by Benedict's rule, had become a trusted authority in the eyes of the people. By donating their land to the church, people hoped to gain God's love and protection in their earthly lives. These donations turned the church into huge networks of land, and these lands made the church a major player in the balance of production and power, the most important element of the feudal system. Monasteries were now centers not only of prayer, but also of wheat fields and tax revenues. So how did the church manage these lands? In the spirit of the feudal system, the church began to administer these lands through vassals. The monks and bishops at the head of the monasteries began to act like feudal lords. They made agreements with knights to protect and cultivate their lands, giving them the right to lease land instead of a salary. This laid the foundation for ties between the church and the feudal lords. Both sides were dependent on each other. The church relied on the feudal lords for physical protection and order. The lords needed the church's support to keep the people in check by feeding their spirituality. But this bond was not limited to land and economy. The church also played an important role in the sanctification of oaths, one of the most important elements of the feudal system. When knights swore allegiance to their lords, these oaths took place under the sacred roof of the church. By sanctifying the oath, the church placed this loyalty under God's supervision, emphasizing that betrayal was not only a worldly, but also a spiritual crime. This further reinforced the moral authority of the church in the feudal system. No matter how great the power of the feudal lords, above them was the authority of God and therefore the authority of the church. But these relations were not always smooth. The church's land ownership and involvement in the feudal system sometimes led to spiritual authority being overshadowed by material interests. Some church leaders were tempted by worldly wealth in the management of monasteries and church properties, prioritizing political and economic power over religious ideals. This situation triggered reform movements within the church. Many religious people were deeply disturbed that the church had forgotten its spiritual mission and started to behave like a feudal lord. This discontent would be the spark for great changes in the centuries to come. But here, dear friends, the big question arises. How was the church able to maintain its spiritual authority in such a worldly system? How did the feudal order grow stronger? And how did the church move forward without losing the ancient claim to spiritual leadership it had inherited from the Roman Empire? Let us seek the answer to this question in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, come closer and listen. I will now take you to a world in turmoil. The majestic pillars of the Roman Empire had fallen, the thrones of the emperors abandoned. Amidst the ruins, humanity was searching for a new order, looking for new leaders and new beliefs. It was in the midst of this chaos that barbarian kingdoms began to rise in the cold forests and rugged lands of Europe. But these kingdoms were shaped not just by sword and shield, but by a new faith, Christianity. This is the story of how the barbarians connected with Christianity, which at that time was growing in small but powerful steps. In the ruins of Rome, the rising voices of the church echoed. Bishops and monks were reaching out from destroyed cities to remote villages, introducing their gods to these new warrior leaders. There was one of these warrior leaders whose name would go down in Christian history in golden letters: Clovis. Clovis was the young and ambitious king of the Franks. He had proven himself on the battlefields and brought his enemies to their knees. But this was only the beginning. Clovis was not content with just expanding his territory. He was also looking for a purpose, a guide for the souls of his people. It is said that one day, in the midst of a fierce battle, as his soldiers writhed in blood and mud, Clovis looked up to the sky and prayed for the first time in his life. He begged the God of the Roman bishops, the Jesus of the Christians, "If I win this battle, I will step into your path." These words changed his fate and that of his people forever. Clovis was victorious. But did he keep his promise? Of course he did. As he bowed to the holy water at his baptism at the hands of Saint Remigius, he converted not only himself but also his people to Christianity. This was not just a conversion. A new order was being born from the ruins of an empire. Clovis's conversion laid the foundation for a strong alliance between the Frankish kingdom and the Church. But what did this alliance mean? The Church was now becoming a force not only of prayer but also of politics. With Clovis' conversion to Christianity, the legacy of Rome would live on in a new form, in the hands of a new leader. During this period, not only the Franks but also many barbarian kings were converting to Christianity. Goths, Visigoths, Vandals. One by one, they all opened their doors to this new faith. But the story of Clovis best illustrates how the Church's political and spiritual power expanded. The Church was becoming not just a center of faith, but a guide for the barbarian kingdoms in their search for a new model of governance. But my friends, I must ask you this. Clovis' decision, as much as it strengthened the Church, also gave it new responsibilities. What kind of relationship would this new alliance create between Church and state? How would the ties between feudal lords and the Church take shape? The answers to these questions are hidden in our next story. Are you ready? Now we will continue our journey through the centuries when the complex dance between the Church and the feudal system began. My dear friends, once again, we are going to shed light on a difficult period, lost in the mists of history. Imagine a sacred faith, once united, now shaken by fragmentation, controversy, and deep conflict. This is a story not only about the struggle between an empire and a spiritual leadership, but also about a battle for the essence of faith, a battle that scorches hearts and minds. Let me take you into the complex world of the 8th century, into the crisis of iconoclasm that erupted in the shadow of the Byzantine throne. It all started in 726, when the Byzantine Emperor Leo III issued an order that shook churches and monasteries. He ordered the removal of icons, sacred images of saints, Jesus and Mary, from churches. He believed that people who prayed before icons idolized them. Leo III feared the wrath of God and thought that the removal of these images would purify the faith. But such an order, my dear friends, not only changed the habits of worship, but also caused deep rifts across the empire. The people felt alienated from God by the banning of icons, and spiritual leaders saw the decision as an unquestionable betrayal. The issue did not remain confined to Byzantium. The papacy in Rome reacted harshly to Leo III's iconoclast policies. Pope Gregory II publicly declared that he did not recognize this decree. The papacy was seen not only as a spiritual authority, but also as a leadership that protected the religious sentiments of the people. The Pope's defiance of Byzantium was not only a bold step, but also a great danger. Because, my dear friends, the Byzantine Empire, as the head of both church and state, saw itself as having the right to rule the entire Christian world. The papacy, on the other hand, was now dreaming of restoring the former glory of Rome and aiming to get out of the shadow of Byzantine. The crisis of iconoclasm shook not only the religious, but also the political balance. The popes in Rome began to rally the local population and the barbarian kingdoms in the West against the Byzantine impositions. The Pope became close to the Frankish kingdom, and this relationship became a turning point that strengthened Western Christianity. During this period, the papacy gradually distanced itself from Byzantium and began to rise as an independent power. But this was not easy. Byzantine emperors imprisoned bishops and priests who defended the icons and looted the monasteries where they were kept. Nevertheless, some of the people secretly maintained their faith in the icons against the emperor. My dear friends, this conflict was a battle not only for lands or thrones, but for the future of hearts and faiths. Finally, in 787, the Council of Nicaea convened and decided that icons should retain their place in the Church. However, this decision neither restored the Byzantine Empire to its former unity, nor bridged the gap with the papacy. The papacy now acted as a power independent of Byzantium. Western Christianity was on a separate path from the East. So, my friends, where was this division going to lead? Was this separation between the papacy and Byzantium the first steps towards a future rupture between the Eastern and Western churches? We will discover the answer to this question together in the following pages of history. My dear friends, let me take you to another turning point in history. It is the mid-8th century. The war cries echoing through the dark forests of Europe have subsided, but the storm of throne games and spiritual power struggles has not. This story is not just about a king being crowned, but about the foundations of an ancient alliance between church and kingdom. This rapprochement between the Frankish kingdom and the papacy marked the beginning of an era that would shape the future of Europe. By 751, the Franks had expanded the borders of their kingdom and had become a powerful and wealthy people. But the throne had long been occupied by the passive kings of the Merovingian dynasty. These kings were now mere symbols in the eyes of the people. The real power was in the hands of a man called Pepin, who had the title of Chamberlain and ruled the love of the people and the army, and managed all the affairs of state skillfully. But, dear friends, there was a problem. Pepin's rule was not legitimate. He was not a king, and this created a deficiency in the eyes of the people. He knew there was only one way to ascend to the throne, with God's permission. And here begins the fascinating moment when Pope Zacharias enters our story. Sitting in Rome, Pope Zacharias had distanced himself from the Byzantine Empire and was looking for ways to increase the power of the papacy in Western Europe. Legitimizing a powerful ally like the Frankish kingdom with the support of the papacy would be a great spiritual and political gain. Pepin knew that without the Pope's support, he could not stay on the throne for long. Therefore, messages went back and forth between Pepin and Pope Zacharias. Pepin posed an open question to the Pope. Should the one who rules the throne be king, or should he be king in name only? Pope Zacharias' answer changed the course of history. He who actually holds the government must be king. This was the confirmation Pepin had been waiting for. In 751, Pepin was proclaimed King of the Franks with the holy support of the Pope. This was not just a coronation, my dear friends. It was the legitimization of a ruler by the Pope, God's representative on earth. With this act, Pope Zacharias declared to the world that the papacy was not only a spiritual, but also a political power. While Pepin's coronation brought the Frankish kingdom into a new era, it was also a turning point for the papacy. The Pope was now becoming an indispensable force on the political stage of Western Europe. However, this alliance was not just a story of gain. While this union determined the future of Western Europe, it also blurred the boundaries between church and kingdom. After the coronation, Pepin was forced to fulfill the papacy's wishes. This showed how complex and intricate the relationship between church and state could be. This involvement of the church in politics would open the door to even greater controversies in the future. So, my dear friends, was Pope Zacharias' decision important only for the rise of kingdoms in the West? Or was it a prelude to a further deepening of the rift between the Roman Church and the Byzantine Church in the East? We will seek the answer to this question together in the next act of history. My dear friends, I will now take you to one of the greatest and most important scenes in history. The year 800, on a cold Christmas day, the ancient walls of Rome echoed with the reverberations of a ceremony that would change the future of Christianity and Europe. What took place that day between the columns of St. Peter's Basilica was not just the enthronement of a man, but the beginning of an era and an ideology. Now, as you listen to this story, you will witness how history is woven together. As king of the Franks, Charlemagne had established a great power in Europe. His successes on the battlefield, his clever alliances, and his territorial expansion made him not only a warrior, but also a leader and an order builder. But Charlemagne had a vision beyond that of a king. He wanted to resurrect the glory of the old Roman Empire. In Charlemagne's eyes, the chaos and fragmentation that had gripped Europe after the fall of Rome had to end. A powerful symbol was needed to unite a continent full of hostile tribes, small kingdoms, and weak leadership. That symbol would be a holy empire. Charlemagne's dream could not be realized alone. At this point, Pope Leo III came on the scene. Leo had suffered a lot from his enemies and political intrigues in Rome, and needed a strong ally to protect his authority. Charlemagne, with his mutual need, paved the way for one of the strongest alliances in history. On Christmas Day 800, when the massive doors of St. Peter's Basilica opened in Rome, everyone knew they were on the verge of a historic moment. Charlemagne attended the ceremony as an ordinary king, but it was Pope Leo III who would write that moment in gold letters in history. At one point in the ceremony, Leo took a crown and placed it on Charlemagne's head, proclaiming him Emperor of Rome. This was not a simple coronation, but a declaration that the Christian West had created a political center independent of Byzantium. This act of the papacy ushered in a new balance of power in the Christian world. The Pope, as God's representative on earth, was now the authority that put emperors on the throne. This was the most important step for the Church, to move from being only a spiritual institution to having a voice on the political stage. Charlemagne gained great power with this crown, but at the same time, he had to submit to papal authority. This was to form the basis of the relationship between the Church and the Empire, cooperation on the one hand and power struggles on the other. Charlemagne's empire shaped the political and cultural unity of Europe that would last throughout the Middle Ages. The establishment of the Holy Roman Empire marked the beginning of the reconstruction of Western Europe. But this unity also laid the groundwork for tensions between church and state. The Pope always considered himself above the Emperor. The Emperor needed the Pope to rule his people. This balance would be tested many times in the years to come. But dear friends, this coronation raises another question. How holy and how Roman was Charlemagne's empire really? How would this new relationship between church and state set the stage for the conflicts that would later erupt in Europe? We will seek the answers to these questions on the next great stage of history. Are you ready? My dear friends, as we plunge into the depths of history, it is important to remember that the Church is not only a spiritual institution, but also a treasury of culture and knowledge. I take you now to the cool stone walls of the monasteries and cathedral schools that lit the lights of the Dark Ages. Let us explore together how the yearning for knowledge for human progress took shape under the guidance of the Church. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the political and social landscape of Europe was complex and often chaotic. Amid the wars for the throne of kings and the conflicts of tribes, monasteries rose like islands of knowledge. Benedictine monasteries became centers of education and learning, especially during this period. In the quiet corridors of the monasteries, ancient manuscripts, priceless at the time, were patiently copied, and ancient wisdom was passed on to the next generation. Not only religious texts, but also the scientific and philosophical works of ancient Greece and Rome were preserved in these sacred places, thus ensuring the continuity of human history. In this process, cathedral schools also began to emerge. In the shadow of the cathedral buildings, young minds were introduced not only to Christian teachings, but also to mathematics, astronomy, and linguistics. The Church's contribution to education fed Europe's thirst for knowledge and paved the way for the establishment of universities in the centuries to come. However, the textbook culture living in London paved the way for the establishment of classes that excluded people from interacting with the actual world around them. In the centuries to come, however, this cultural role of the Church was not limited to education. Art was also an instrument of power in the hands of the Church. Music, architecture, and painting were used to bring people closer to the glory of God. The soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals and the scenes in stained glass windows reminded people of heaven. However, this brilliant period of the Church was not without its problems. Over time, the corruption within the Church led to reform movements that criticized the papacy and the clergy. At this point, Pope Gregory VII appeared on the scene. In 1073, Gregory was crowned pope and launched a war to restore the spiritual purity of the Church. This war was not only against internal problems, but also an effort to rid the Church of the influence of secular leaders. The custom of selling church offices for money, called simony, was one of Gregory's most fierce opponents. Clerical marriage, the marriage of priests, was banned on the grounds that it polluted the spiritual life. With these reforms, Gregory aimed to make the Church independent of secular control. In particular, his conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV in Germany showed how fierce and sharp the Church's struggle against secular authorities was. In this period, Gregory demonstrated the power of the Church not only in the spiritual sphere, but also on the political stage with his famous March of Canossa. My dear friends, these reform movements fundamentally changed the relationship between religion and state in Europe. However, the revolution initiated by Gregory was not only a transformation within the Church, but also the beginning of new conflicts. How would this balance between the Church's contribution to education and the arts, and its struggle to maintain spiritual purity, take shape in the centuries to come? Was the Church's struggle with secular leaders a harbinger of a greater crisis? We will explore this together in our next story. Are you ready? My dear friends, I take you back to those old, complicated times when the Church was both a center of power and a place of purification. We are now embarking on a journey into the depths of the 10th century. This period witnesses the birth of a torch that burns even in the dark corners of Europe. The Cluny monastic reforms. The Cluny movement not only changed monastic life, it was a revolution that redefined the Church and the spiritual power of the Church. In 910, when the Abbey of Cluny was founded in a small village in the Burgundy region of France, no one could have imagined how profoundly transformative it would be. The abbey had been donated by William of Aquitaine, but a condition attached to this donation set it apart. The Abbey of Cluny was to be completely free from pressure from worldly lords or local nobles. It was subject only to the papacy, and this independence would ensure that the abbey would remain pure, both physically and spiritually. In many places, the monasteries of the time had fallen prey to worldly interests, and the monks were distracted from their spiritual mission. The nobility used the monasteries for their own political power, turning monastic life into a kind of worldly competition. But the Abbey of Cluny defied this corruption and became a refuge where monks devoted their lives to prayer and study. Ora et labora, pray and work. This principle was the cornerstone of the Cluny reforms. It was not only this independence that distinguished Cluny from other monasteries. The daily life of the monks here was characterized by strict discipline. Prayers, psalm readings, and spiritual retreats filled every hour of the day. These monks became both role models and teachers for young minds from all over Europe. And Cluny gradually became a model. Other monasteries joined the reform movement, creating a Cluniac network. This movement reestablished the spiritual power of the Church by purging monastic life of worldly influences. The Cluny reforms were not limited to monasteries. It also resonated in the general structure of the Church. The papacy, empowered by this reform movement, positioned itself as the spiritual leader of Europe. The search for order and authority in the Church further increased the conflict with secular leaders. In particular, simony, the selling of ecclesiastical positions for money, became one of the biggest targets of the Cluny reforms. These reforms not only restored religious purity, but also consolidated the power of the papacy in Europe. My dear friends, this spiritual awakening, which began within the stone walls of the Cluny Abbey, eventually spread to the farthest corners of Europe. But like any change, these reforms were not without their challenges and new problems. These reforms would bring even greater controversy and conflict in the centuries to come. But what kind of future would the path paved by Cluny eventually lead the Church to? And how did these reforms shape not only monastic life, but also the political and social structure of Europe? Now we will look for answers to these questions. Are you ready? My dear friends, let me now take you to one of the greatest upheavals of the Middle Ages. This story tells not only of a conflict between a pope and an emperor, but also of a struggle that would define the limits of the power of religion and state, a struggle that would influence centuries to come. The late 11th and early 12th centuries witnessed this great conflict that shaped both the political and spiritual map of Europe. The Investiture Crisis. It all started in 1075 with a dispute between Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. But this was no simple disagreement, my dear friends. This was a battle to determine who had the real power. Investiture, the power to appoint religious leaders, was one of the most contentious issues between church and state at the time. By appointing bishops and church leaders, emperors were consolidating both their religious and political power. But Pope Gregory was determined to put a definitive end to this situation. The church was to be the house of God, not the palace of emperors. In a proclamation he called Dictatus Papae, Pope Gregory declared that only the church had the power to appoint spiritual leaders. This echoed throughout Europe. But would Henry IV have remained silent? Of course not. He saw this declaration as a challenge. He openly declared that he did not recognize the authority of the Pope and convened a council to depose the Pope. But my dear friends, Gregory did not bow to this threat. He excommunicated Henry. Yes, an emperor deprived of God's forgiveness. Can you imagine? It was a scandal in the eyes of the people. Things got even worse for Henry. The nobles in his empire began to question the authority of an excommunicated leader. This forced Henry to make a decision: either reconcile with the Pope or lose his throne. It was here that one of the most dramatic scenes in history took place: the March of Canossa. In the winter of 1077, barefoot and covered in snow, Henry arrived at the gates of Canossa Castle. He waited for days to ask the Pope for forgiveness. In the end, Gregory forgave Henry and lifted the excommunication. But dear friends, this peace did not last long. Henry regrouped his forces and attacked Rome, sending Gregory into exile. This conflict was not just a struggle between two men, it was a war that radically changed the relationship between church and state in Europe. Finally, to put an end to this chaos, a treaty called the Concordat of Worms was signed in 1122. It was a compromise in which the spiritual powers of bishops were to be exercised solely by the Pope, while their temporal duties were to be appointed by the Emperor. The supremacy of the Church was consolidated, but the role of the state was not completely excluded. This crisis, my dear friends, proclaimed to the whole of Europe that the Church and the state were two separate powers. But was this separation really permanent? Or was this struggle only a prelude to greater conflicts to come? In our next story, we will dive deeper into this complex relationship between church and state. Are you ready? My dear friends, I will now take you through one of the most striking periods in history between faith and power, the Great Crusades, that changed the destiny not only of Europe, but of almost the entire medieval world, electrifying and yet exhausting the people. This is the story of how one man's call, the voice of Pope Urbanus II, affected the lives of millions and made the Church the supreme authority in almost the entire Christian world. It all began in 1095 at the Council of Clermont. Pope Urbanus II stood before the assembled crowd and began to speak with rising fervor. His was not just the voice of a leader, but the voice of God's spokesman. Urbanus spoke of how Jerusalem was in Muslim hands, how the Holy Land had become a place of torment for Christian pilgrims. Egiamonte phantom limbs after the camaraderie of mathematics, chemistry, and physics. Deus vult, he cried. God wills it. This sentence echoed in the hearts of people all over Europe. Everyone from kings to peasants took up arms to join this holy cause. The Crusades were seen as not just a war, but a hope for salvation, a way of redemption. But, my dear friends, the motives behind these crusades were not only religious. The Church saw them as a way to increase its authority over the people. Pope Urbanus II organized this great movement to unite the Christian world under his umbrella. Feudal lords put aside their territorial disputes and united to fight in the name of God. In this process, the Church became not only a spiritual guide, but also a political and military leader. The victories of the Crusaders brought the power of the Church to its peak. The capture of Jerusalem created an atmosphere of triumph throughout Europe. But there were also aspects of the campaigns that ended in failure. Blood, tears, and destruction, all in the name of a holy cause, left a deep mark on the Christian world. But this, dear friends, was only the beginning of the power of the Church. By the mid-12th century, the papacy was transforming from a purely religious institution into a centralized governmental structure. The architect of this transformation was Pope Innocentius III. Under his leadership, the Church consolidated its power in both the spiritual and secular spheres. The Pope was no longer just a religious leader, but an arbiter, a kingmaker who determined the political balance of Europe. Innocentius went down in history as a leader who could even shake the authority of kings. During his reign, the papacy strengthened its taxation system, expanded its diplomatic network, and took tighter control of churches and monasteries in every corner of Europe. The papacy became a center of power, and even kings were overshadowed by it. But my friends, was not this rise of the Church's power a harbinger of new conflicts? How did the papacy's rise to power provoke a reaction from the kings and nobles of Europe? What events took place in this great balancing act between church and state? We will look for the answers to these questions in our next story. Are you ready? My friends, let me now take you back to one of the dark and frightening chapters of history, to a time far away, to the late 12th and early 13th centuries. At that time, in the heart of Europe, the foundations of Christian faith and authority were being shaken by a great struggle. The Church was doing its best to protect the people from straying from the path of God. But this protection would soon turn into a terrible persecution, an age in which fear, not justice, ruled. It was then that the Church had at its disposal the courts of the Inquisition, set up to combat heresy. Heresy, in the eyes of the Church, was not just an error of faith, but a disease that shook the foundations of a society, threatening an entire order. The Church wanted to control and guide each individual to live in accordance with God's will. But no distrust or tolerance was required, only obedience and submission. With this in mind, the Church's greatest enemy was to use all its power to find and destroy heretics. By the mid-12th century, the papacy had devised a method to eradicate heresy. Unfortunately, it led to one of the darkest forms of justice, the Inquisition. The Inquisition began not as a court, but as a system of investigation. It was believed that everything would be done in the name of God, for a spiritual purpose. The Church did not hesitate to accuse the people of heresy while ruling as God's representative on earth, to defend the right path within itself. In every village, in every town, men of the Church searched for signs of heresy, announcing that those who denounced the guilty would be rewarded and receive God's forgiveness. This spread like a wave of social fear. No one knew that their neighbor or friend could be accused of heresy and disappear. The darkest side of the Inquisition became famous for its inquisitions. The trials began with a predetermined guilt. Every suspect, when summoned to court, was questioned without being certain of his guilt. And the interrogation methods used to decide whether a person was guilty or not were unfortunately quite brutal. Torture was used to force confessions not only from the guilty, but sometimes from the innocent. There were those who were truly guilty, but many others were forced to confess only out of fear, unable to bear the pain inflicted on their bodies. During this fearful time, many people tried to understand how cruel God's justice and the mercy of the Church could be. But unfortunately, during this period, a widening gulf between God's way and the truth became ever wider. Every heresy was seen as a threat to the social order, and in the face of this, the Inquisition courts took it upon themselves to carry out a great purge in the name of God's. But what did this fear, this fight, eventually lead to? How did these struggles of the Church change the beliefs of the people? How did the dark face of the Inquisition leave deep scars on society? I will give you the answers to these questions in a moment. Are you ready? My friends. Now I am going to tell you about a time that, however distant and dark it may be, the effects of that era will still be felt in every word you hear. Close your eyes for a moment and take a journey back to the early 14th century, to those turbulent days in the heart of Europe, even to the south of France, to Avignon. In those days, the papacy had moved far away from Rome. Now, picture Rome, the greatest religious center in history, the city of thousands of years of tradition, the magnificent buildings and the Holy Land. But one morning, imagine the popes left Rome and never came back. Yes, this decision was taken when Clement de Fave, the pope of that time, traveled far away from Rome to the French lands to Avignon. In 1309, Avignon suddenly became the home of the popes. So what happened to make this happen? When the popes left Rome, at first glance, it might seem like just a move. But the move symbolized the beginning of a much deeper political and spiritual crisis for the Church and the religious world. On the one hand, the ancient splendor of Rome and all its religious heritage, and on the other, the papacy, which found itself a new power on French soil. This relocation changed not only the physical but also the spiritual and political power of the Church. The relocation of the papacy to Avignon led the popes to move away from their traditional authority in Rome and to establish much closer relations with the Kingdom of France. While the Kingdom of France greatly strengthened its relations with the popes, many Catholics who remained in Rome saw this change as a kind of betrayal. The popes no longer represented the spirit of a people in Rome, but a political power on French soil. During this period, a kind of political alliance was formed between the papacy and the Kingdom of France. Avignon became a kind of papal capital, but this meant keeping a great distance from the religious center in Rome. However, the papacy in Avignon had become the center not only of papal authority, but also of all church affairs in Europe. Here, everything was shaped in some way in the interests of the Kingdom of France. Religious and political affairs were intertwined. Although the papacy was recognized as God's representative on earth, the popes in Avignon began to act as an extension of the French throne. This situation started to draw the reaction of other European states. In particular, the move of the papal capital in Italy from Rome to Avignon deeply shook the religious structure in this region, even the faith of the people. The close relationship of the popes in Avignon with the French administration was not welcomed by many Catholics, who questioned the true sanctity of the Church. But the popes who moved to Avignon also faced their own internal crisis. This period in Avignon was shaped not only by pressures from the outside world, but also by rivalries between popes. As one pope after another tried to free the papal throne in Avignon from each other's pressures and delusions, they tried to regain their ecclesiastical and spiritual authority by trying to return to Rome. However, these struggles led to a kind of schism among the popes, and unfortunately to more chaos. In 1377, finally the papacy decided to return to Rome. But the effects of this period were to cause years of division and deep wounds within the papacy and the Church. When we talk about the dark history of a divided Church, but were the effects of this history limited to the play of the popes on the throne? How would this rivalry between Rome and Avignon change the boundaries of religion and state in Europe? Let us examine how this divided Church shaped the social structures of Europe. My friends, now close your eyes once more and take a trip back in time to the late 14th century. Imagine the papal capital in Avignon. The papacy returned to Rome. But things did not simply go smoothly, because like everything else in Europe, the religious structures of this period were caught in a storm, and it was at this time that the terrible schism called the Western Schism broke out. Let me explore what happened in the midst of this chaos and tell you how we were dragged into a historical catastrophe. The return of the papacy to Rome seemed like a salvation, but it soon brought dark clouds over the papacy. In 1377, after the death of Pope Gregory VI, a new pope was elected. But this election got out of control in a way that threatened the interests of almost every European country. Everybody wanted their own name on the papal throne. And what happened, my friends? At that very moment, popes appeared in Rome and in Avignon. Two separate papacies, two separate claims, two separate administrations. Whereas the papacy, united by an authority derived from God, should have been one whole, one body. But now things became so complicated that the faith of the people was shattered by this confusion with more than one pope. At first, on the side of the papacy in Rome, there was a Pope Urbanus VI, and on the side in Avignon, there was another pope, Clement VII. Both declared themselves to be the true pope, but did not recognize each other's legitimacy. Tragically, there were self-righteous beliefs on both sides. Each pope gained his own group of followers. On the one side, the papacy in Avignon was supported by the French, and on the other side, the pope in Rome was defended by the Italians and some groups from other European countries. So this period of two papacies, which we call the Western Schism, was not only the beginning of a religious schism, but also the beginning of a terrible period of intertwined politics. Each of the popes did everything in his power to consolidate his own holy claims and authority. It was not only a religious but also a political war. Both popes pressured the kingdoms of Europe to choose their side. On all sides, diplomatic relations were strained and a series of alliances were formed, sometimes even between countries that were hostile to each other. Both papacies resorted to military force to consolidate their power. The faithful followers of the popes themselves were thrown into this great chaos by the question, who is the real pope? Instead of being the holiest and most united, the church was now divided and in a process of internal decay. Its reputation in the eyes of the people was also shaken over time. Many began to question whether these papal conflicts were the will of God or the ambitions of man. Unrest, civil unrest, crises of faith, religious authority was growing weaker every day. In Europe, the church was in front of everything. Religious ceremonies, prayer, loyalty, everything was in the hands of the popes. But now, these two popes, for the sake of their own egos, disregarded all these sacred teachings and shook the confidence of the church. Finally, this mess ended in 1417, but by then the papacy had gone through one of its darkest periods. Finally, a compromise was reached, and the decision was taken to end this period. A third papacy, a third meeting, was held at the Council of Constance, and both popes were forced to abdicate. A new pope was elected, but unfortunately, the schism of the Church, its power and prestige in the eyes of the people, could never be the same again. But my friends, it was not only the turmoil on the papal throne, but also the collapse of the religious and spiritual sentiments of the people of Europe that was crucial in turning the Western Schism into a historical catastrophe. This catastrophe showed how the institution of the papacy gradually lost its power, and how this sacred institution in the eyes of the people was viewed with more and more suspicion. And then what? How did the papacy recover from this great catastrophe? How would this fierce rivalry between the popes rebalance religion and politics? If you're wondering that, I'm about to satisfy your curiosity. My dear friends, if you close your eyes for a moment and immerse yourself with the glittering period of the Renaissance, you will see a very interesting sight. The early 15th century was both a triumph and the beginning of a great catastrophe for the papacy. On the one hand, artists, scientists, and philosophers from all over Europe were struggling to rediscover the most beautiful values of the ancient world. And on the other, the papacy was once again publicly seeing itself as a symbol of great power. But at this very moment, the papacy was experiencing one of the greatest crises in history. Let's take a closer look at the color, light, and darkness of this period. During the golden years of the Renaissance in the 15th century, the papacy was supporting some of the greatest artistic and cultural projects in history, while at the same time facing accusations of deep corruption. Some historians even called this period the Papal Renaissance, because the popes led not only a religious, but also an artistic and cultural revolution. But my friends, the most important thing to note here is that the papacy was not only a religious authority, it was also one of the most powerful, richest, and most influential rulers in Europe. It was Julius I, one of the popular popes of the time, who commissioned Michelangelo to decorate the Sistine Chapel. He spent his life painting the huge ceiling, and the walls of the church were filled with images of scripture, prophets, and the life of God. But this was not just, a giant work of art that symbolized the power of the papacy. As the saying goes, art and power are inseparable. And that is exactly what the papacy was doing in Europe at that time. And what about the popes themselves? They too had become so fond of art that the church city of Rome became a center of art. Every corner, every wall, every statue reflected the splendor of the papacy. But my friends, as all that glitters has its shadow, so too did this enormous artistic endeavor and ostentatious power have its dark side. In the golden years of the Renaissance, the papacy was engaged in great cultural and artistic projects on the one hand, and in the grip of corruption on the other. While both popes and the church lived in great wealth and splendor, in the eyes of the people, this wealth had turned from a sanctity that glorified God into an extravagance spent for material gain. Bribes, spending from church revenues, the church's interference in world affairs, and even the accumulation of wealth for themselves, instead of fulfilling their religious duties, aroused great criticism among the people. One of the most vocal critics of the corruption of the papacy during this period would be the great reformer Martin Luther. However, there was still a long time before the Great Reform movement would begin. Until those days, during the Renaissance period, the religious feelings of the people and their trust in the papacy were gradually being shaken. But was this intense interest in art really to decorate the house of God? Or was there something more at stake? Although the popes helped artists with large prizes and donations, many saw this as a consolidation of ecclesiastical power with worldly riches. Unfortunately, it was not easy to strike a balance between church and art. The revolutionary aspect of art captivated the public, but it also exposed the weaknesses of the papacy. With the power of these art projects, the papacy aimed to renew itself and consolidate its religious and political dominance in Europe. In reality, however, in Europe, the Church, adorned with art, was creating a crisis of faith among the people. Underneath this splendor, there was a kind of internal decay. People began to realize that religious leaders were putting their greed for money and power above true religious service. My dear friends, we have now come to the end of a long journey. Although when we began this historical odyssey, we intended to tell only a story about the church, art, and power. We have been confronted with a vast world. Here we have seen a series of changes, struggles, and corruption, from the glory of the papacy at its peaks to its darkest corners. The glitter of art was often a reflection of dirty power plays. By promoting the art of the Renaissance, the popes opened the door to a great cultural revolution, but it also paved the way for their transformation in the eyes of the people into an institution fueled by greed and wealth, deviating from the true spirit of religion. These transitions in the history of the papacy reveal how the Church, once seen as a source of religious light, became a complex web of political power, wealth, and corruption. Although the papacy shone as a power fueled by the arts, it unfortunately suffered a loss of trust in the eyes of the people. And these deepening contradictions would eventually give birth to the idea of a giant change, perhaps a revolution. The artistic opulence of the Renaissance, the splendor of the popes, became symbols that highlighted the complex relationship between religion and power throughout history. And now, my friends, we have come to the end of an era in this story. But remember that history, like a flowing river, continues uninterrupted. Questions about the papacy still remain unanswered. The historical struggle of the people and the rulers is always haunting, like a dark shadow. But what would become of the people's faith in the Church in the end? And how would this great change affect not only the papacy, but the whole of Europe? What happened next will reveal the mystery behind all these processes and the great changes.